This is the Pentax DA 300mm f4 lens, and it's a beast. I plan to make a video just about this lens and how good it is in the future, so look out for that. But this video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be going over my experience with using this lens on both the Pentax K-1 and K-3 and talk about some advantages and disadvantages between the two. You might think there's a clear winner, but there's not. And this isn't really a comparison, which is better, the K-1 or the K-3, but this might get your mind rolling if you're considering this lens and pairing it up with either of the cameras, or maybe thinking about that new K3 Mark III. First, I'll just let you know, all the images you're seeing, I'm going to have high quality versions of those and a link in the description. That'll be to the community forum post where I talk about this, and you can see the images there and discuss more. So check it out. First, why did I even want to try this on the K1 and K3? Well, because I have both of them, and as much as I like old cameras, and you know that, I don't really want a ton of them. So anytime I can consolidate cameras is a good day. And I'm thinking about whether or not I really need to keep the K3. The K3 has a lot of advantages for wildlife and sports photographers, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the K1 is such a good camera. You're not seeing it right now because that's what I'm filming with, but it is there. The K1 is such a capable camera that I wanted to see if it could replace the K1 for my use case in wildlife photography with the DA 300mm lens. So let's talk about that. I'm going to put this down because it is very heavy. I've broken this up into different categories. We're going to be talking about how the camera and the lens focus, the ISO performance between the two cameras, and things like that. So first off, the focusing. The focusing speed between the two cameras is actually about the same. In practical terms, I didn't really notice much of a difference in speed or accuracy. My hit rate between both cameras seemed about the same. I got some wonderful shots in focus, and I got some frustrating out of focus shots. I did, however, notice something a little bit different between the two cameras. The K1 seemed a little bit more confident. When it picked a focusing point, it just would flow into it and lock on. The K3 seemed more jittery, like it would hop back and forth between those little micro jitters to hop into focus. Like I said, in practical terms, I don't know if this actually led to any more shots in focus or out of focus between the two, but I certainly felt more confident with the K1 because it felt confident, if that makes any sense. And just to let you know, my focusing mode, after trying a bunch of different kind of styles, the one that I like, I find works well on Pentax systems, is continuous focusing, do the single point, center point, and then I put the AF on the back button and decouple it from the shutter button. And that way I can fire whenever and it won't try to focus, and I can just control focus with the AF button. That becomes particularly helpful when you're locking focus and you feel like you don't need to refocus. You've kind of pre-focused, but then you need to really quickly focus again. Then I can mash on this button and get back in focus before I keep going. So it's kind of a dance between these two buttons, but it works out pretty well. I'm still pretty new to this though, so if you have more tips on focusing with any camera, or particularly Pentax cameras, because it's a little bit of a game that way, then let me know. I could use the tips. Okay, number 2, ISO performance. And there is a big difference between the K3 and the K1's high ISO performance. I remember when I first got the K3, and I was jumping up from, I think my last Pentax camera before that was the K200D. So a huge step up between the two, like a 2008 camera to a 2013 camera. And it was a huge difference. I could not believe how well the K3 handled high ISO. And I still can. It's really quite amazing. The problem is when you start comparing things side to side, which is really dangerous. Side by side, the K1 just blows out of the water again. It's like another huge upgrade. Like when I went from the K200D to the K3, going to the K3 to the K1 is a huge difference. I don't know technically how much better the ISO performance is on the K1 versus the K3, but subjectively, I found myself, I felt about 2 stops more confident, meaning that if I 1600 on the K3, 3200 is really the limit for wildlife pictures for me on the K3, but really I'd prefer to be 1600 or lower. On the K1, I would go 2 stops above that. So instead of 1600, my cutoff would be 6400. And this is really helpful because, as you know, in wildlife photography, you're constantly fighting to keep that shutter speed really, really high, and even working with the aperture so you can get more shots in focus, and that leaves you often having to bump up the ISO. So once again, the K3 is extremely capable, especially for a $300 to $400 camera nowadays, but the K1 just is really much better in that regard. Okay, now because the K1 had a turn winning against the K3, we'll let the K3 win this next one, and that is frame rate. The drive mode in the K3 is about twice the speed of the fastest drive mode in the K1. The K1's about 4 or 4.5 frames per second, and the K3 is 8.3 or something like that. 4 versus 8. And this makes a really big difference, especially in the shots that you're seeing with the birds hunting for fish. You kind of just anticipate when the bird is going to make a move into the water, and then you burst. And you get just a second of time, and you hope to get as many frames in that second as possible. And in that way, the K3 definitely wins. And this is 4 frames per second on the K1 is still enough to have a lot of fun with. This isn't one of those don't even bother with the K1. But I'm just saying, in practical terms, as an amateur wildlife photographer, having those extra frames per second was particularly helpful. Okay, the final category, and the one that you might have been thinking of from the beginning when you heard I was comparing the K1, a full frame body, with the K3, an APS-C body, is reach. Because the K3 is a crop body, it of course has that extra reach. So this 300mm lens becomes about a 450mm equivalent lens. You would think that would normally win when you have subjects that you really want to get closer to. However, because of what I've said about the K1's higher ISO performance and just overall image quality, plus because of its 36 megapixel resolution, I'm able to crop in and I either match the performance of the K3 at that 450mm focal length, or I even exceed it. I exceed it in situations where it's dark and I have to bump up the ISO of the K3. Then the K1 cropped in beats it. This is of course subjective. This isn't a scientific test. I didn't go out and shoot the same subject in the same settings and do that. But over switching back and forth between these cameras, I probably used this lens on the K1 7 times and this lens on the K3 10 times. And going back and forth, that has been my experience. Another thing to note, however, is that if you want to use a teleconverter like Pentax's latest HD DA 1.4x, I don't even remember, teleconverter, it's advertised that it will work on full frame, but from what I've read online, with the 300mm lens at least, it vignettes on full frame pretty bad. So it really is only viable for APS-C, at least with this lens. I don't really understand the whole situation, but that's just what I've been hearing from other people. So, is there a clear winner between the two? Well, as I said at the beginning, this isn't really a K1 versus K3 video, because that doesn't make a lot of sense, even in this regard. What I wanted to highlight was some of my personal experiences using the two cameras, and it's really quite interesting. At the beginning, I thought the K3 would be the winner because of it's just more capable for things like wildlife and sports and action with its longer reach and its higher frame rates. However, because the K1 has such a newer sensor and processor and can deal with those high ISO situations more, and its higher resolution, that reach becomes less of an issue, and then its image quality is just so good with this lens that it's kind of a toss-up. It's hard to say. I was hoping I would learn a little bit more. I'm thinking about getting rid of my K3 and just keeping the K1 so I can consolidate down to one camera. Still not quite sure yet. Both of these cameras are extremely capable, and this lens makes them shine. If you watched a couple weeks ago, I shot the DA 300mm lens on my Pentax K10D, a much older camera body, and it was still awesome. So the answer is this lens is awesome. But if you're choosing between the K1 and K3, or were just curious about the performance between the two, there you go. There's my personal experiences. They're both very good in different ways, and it surprised me how well the K1 compensated for some of its weaknesses in wildlife and sports because of that wonderful image quality. The other good news is pretty soon you won't have to choose between the two. The K3 Mark III promises that newer processor and image resolution, and really even newer than the K1 and maybe better than the K1 in many ways, combined with a capable high frame rate, long reach body, APS-C body. So that's really exciting for wildlife photographers. As for me, I'm cheap, so I will probably just stick to this guy. Thanks for watching. Once again, hop over to the community forum. People there are really nice, and if you just want to chat or talk anything photography related, stop by there and say hey and I'll respond. Do you shoot wildlife or any sort of action with a Pentax camera and lens? Let me know your setup, let me know your settings and some tips and tricks. I'm really new to this, so I'm learning, and anything I can pick up is good. No matter what camera you have, no matter what lens you have, remember to go out there and shoot wherever you are with whatever you got. And until next time, happy snapping.